why don't we go around the room so that and everybody can maybe give a brief background, just so they feel for everybody. So, why don't we start? Tom's not an official member, so he started this, and we're going to blend in.
I'm Tom Head, obviously, and with some of my cohorts were the basis of the City of Lewes Committee under Planning Commission before it was disbanded, and then was director of the Board of Public Works.
But your educational background.
Oh,
and
I'm a nuclear engineer,
work, so.
nuclear engineer, civil engineer, and an economist. So it makes me qualified for nothing.
I was telling Tom that at the St. Peter's art show on Saturday, Sunday, I saw a guy, he had a t-shirt on it, said, I'm a nuclear engineer. We've been practicing social distancing for years.
Good t-shirt. I'm Bob Heffernan. Long time ago, I got a mechanical engineering degree, and an MBA at one point. I was a member of the Sea Level Rise part of the subcommittee of Planning Commission, and central part of my career has been in industry. But one thing I did was run a company that made flow measurement instruments for everything from sewage treatment to unloading oil tankers to things that made semiconductors. So
Thanks for joining us, Barbara.
I'm Barbara Curtis. My educational background, I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy and a graduate degree from Drexel in environmental science. And managed to get in there because all my electives were science. I don't know why I did philosophy. But I've worked in industry my whole career in health, safety, and environment. And more recently, the past several years have been primarily in remediation projects. But I was involved in planning stages for new buildings and new plant and equipment. Negotiating permits for sewage treatment, or industrial wastewater treatment permits and air permits and things like that. So
Good. Robin.
Robin Davis. I'm the assistant general manager for the BPW. I've been with the BPW for about 6 months now. Was previously with the city as a building official for 7.5 years. So made that big move about 30 feet to a
We stole.
So I previously had a state of Delaware water license and a wastewater level 2 license and I currently have a plumbing license for the state of Delaware.
John.
I am the executive assistant for the BPW. I do have an associate's in general business, and I'll be here to take the minutes and keep you all on track.
And she's good at that.
Don't mess with our.
That's right.
Austin Calman, General Manager for Lewes Board of Public Works. I've been here 6 years, a little over 6 years now. My degree is in supply chain operations management from a little college up in York. And really, this whole discussion about mitigation was kind of, created because you have the city mitigation that looks at like city assets and everything has to do with the city. But the board truly being a separate entity, really has to think about what we have, what we're dealing with. And this kind of goes into the discussion today is that, in my view, mitigation is not only mitigation in terms of sea level rise, but also in today's day and age, you're dealing with supply chain issues. And that is a huge thing that we're dealing with now, from transformers to meters, et cetera. So I look at that as almost like a risk management perspective as well.
Mark Prouty, I'm a retired engineer. I had worked as a sewage treatment plant operator for 6 years while I was going to school at Maryland. And when I got out, I got hired by that guy over there and worked for 37 years as a civil engineer designing water and wastewater treatment plants.
Senator Crosby, I was also on the Sea Level Rise Committee of the Planning Commission for however long it met before it was disbanded. I'm glad to see that we're at it again. I have a undergraduate degree in geology, graduate degree in environmental planning from the University of Pennsylvania. Worked at the Environmental Protection Agency, did a lot of geographic information system stuff, a lot of environmental assessment, sort of putting together available information to help senior managers do things. I've been a school teacher, played around with farming for a while. I've done a lot of different things.
And he's got
Molly-
bees.
And I'm a
Bees.
beekeeper. Yeah, I spend a lot of time doing bees now. Anyway, so I am really looking forward to this. So
Thank you, thank you all. I'm Preston Lee, I'm a professional engineer. My entire career, except for my first year, is in consulting engineering for mostly water, wastewater, stormwater types of projects. I had a firm, as Sid Mark was with us, and we worked together, I guess, 30 years, 40 years, something like that. So then I went on my own at the end, and for the last 10 or 12 years, I was just doing work. With an individual. Any revisions, or this is done, any revisions or deletions to the agenda? The agenda is pretty damn short. So if we deleted the first item, we'd be done. Good adjournment. I guess the first thing we have to do is decide what this committee is going to do. And you saw in the resolution that was prepared, it was very brief. It didn't really give us much direction other than advising the board and the BPW on issues related to mitigation of sea level rise. And it wasn't even that specific, just the mitigation. How they word it, but basically anything that happens to utilities. And again, I blame it on Tom to get this thing started, and he came up with the original idea. So Tom, why don't you give us an idea of what you were thinking at the time? So,
But she says a mutual admiration. I blame this all on Tress, because he's the one who decided to step down as president of the board. So just so you know where we're coming from, we don't like each other. My thoughts were going back from sea level rise, which was much broader, and that's a misnomer, because we were focusing on sea level rise and climate change. It was adverse weather events that would potentially put city assets and public assets and life and health of the public at risk. Our charter as the BPW is much narrower. So we have control over water, wastewater, electric, gas, although the city has hired, subcontracted that to Chesapeake, stormwater, and other utilities as determined. There's some fuzzy clause in there. So, and different from what we were doing under the Planning Commission, we run critical assets as opposed to houses. So in general, critical assets are specified separately in FEMA, and just from a perspective, you tend to build higher factors of safety into utility type critical structures. So what I see the very top level charter is that we'd like to see the committee come up with recommendations on what to do with our assets to both protect them from damage, to minimize the cost associated with damage and recovery, and ensure ranking wise, the most critical ones survive. And by the way, I was chased out of Annapolis last night by a tornado.
oh, there were warnings here.
Dropped my nephew at school, And as they're coming out, the tornado sirens go off, and they break into the radio, and they say, if you're in a motor vehicle or a mobile home or trailer park, take safety. What does that mean? I'm on Route 50. It's bumper to bumper traffic.
Stay off.
I diverge it. So, some of the most critical ones, obviously, is the wastewater treatment plant. It's above flood stage now. It's above flood stage within the near-term future. But frankly, and as everyone who's read the material knows, our flood stages are set by FEMA. And the 100-year flood stage, we have approached 4.9 times in the last 10 years. And the only reason why it's 0.9 is one of the storms we were a couple of tenths of an inch below the rainfall. So for all time, we had 4 to 5 100-year storms in 10 years. The probability of that is next to zero. And so we need to figure out what we want to do, what risk the wastewater treatment plant is, what we do in the interim, low-lying infrastructure, our above-ground infrastructure, the poles, the electric system, to protect it from hurricanes and winds, the water tower, things like that. So anyway, that's what I see the high level is, and looking for you guys to categorize, put some meat on it, and come back with recommendations. And so it's both risk and cost.
And that, as I understand it, 62 storm wasn't even a 100-year storm by the way they classified.
Yeah.
And that was much higher than 100-year storms that we've experienced.
So everyone knows, and I know some of them Bob do. The 100-year storm is based on a 40-year historical look back, projecting forward, which always served FEMA very well historically. But anyone who's seen any climate change curves, the curve is going like this. The precipitation curves, 40-inch rainfalls in the Carolinas, 50 inches in Houston, the one that came through, that wiped out Elkhart in Maryland. So, yeah, the 100-year storm, those classifications are, way past. And FEMA is not doing anything for the next 5 years.
And the 500-year storm is 1.7 feet high.
Yeah, one of the problems you guys are going to have, or the problem is that, it also need to show you eventually on a map, the 100-year floodplains are mapped out topologically and with elevations. The 500-year map is kind of like, but there's no elevations associated with it. And so it becomes difficult, it's either Norfolk or Virginia Beach adopted the 500-year floodplain with elevations from 100 year. So they increased the area, but they still did. Other places are actually going in and doing their own mapping, which is probably beyond what we can financially afford here. But anyway,
I came across this 62 storm. You see that big one?
Yeah.
I guess one of the first things,
I didn't know if we got a couple.
it looks like, doesn't it? How do we interplay? I don't think we want to, I think I mentioned this in an earlier email. We don't want to redo determining what the impact's going to be of the storms. I think that's been done. And I think, so we could spend a lot of time getting into that again, unless there's a feeling that there's something that we should We can, I think, start from what's already been done, like, we have the executive summary from the state's plan, I think, there's someplace. Yeah, it's third one down. You bring that up.
Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a while since I've looked at that FEMA flood study process. It was, as you said, an historical analysis, building a set of probabilities. It did not include in that set of probabilities an analysis of the curves, sea level rise, and so on. So it's simply looking backward and projecting forward based on what's happened in the past. But if there's one thing I think is critical, is that we somehow properly incorporate the sea level rise figures, and there's a lot of numbers you can choose from to determine a planning path that's more conservative than just historical analysis.
I went to an engineering conference earlier this year for the American Public Power Association. And it seemed to be the predominant way that a lot of the municipalities or utilities were getting around that issue was because you can get the data from FEMA. And what they were doing was they were waiting the last 10 years or only using the last 10 years, in both cases, rather than the 40-year, because the tail is what really pulls everything down. It still doesn't address the increasing slope of the curve.
So,
But it's better than nothing, and it's an existing data set.
so is there a feeling we should investigate that or get back into that? That seems like a major task in itself, if we wanted to go back and dig that up. Polish it up.
Is somebody already doing it?
Well,
We could make use of it.
page down on that, they have a number in there, and I think, not that down, you guys have. It has a number in there.
Chris, I think one of the critical questions is, what's the time frame?
Hold there, right there. They have a sea level rise right there on the left, at the bottom of that. They have some numbers. So should we start with this type of thing, or should we get back in more detail, things that you were working on with the cities? This is the state, it's a couple of years old, of course. But should we build on this, or should we redevelop?
Well, I mean, one way to think, when we were trying to work with the city and getting advice from the state, they are very reluctant to, each of the individual engineers starts with, these are the limitations of what I do.
That's our first class.
Yeah. And so listening to many presentations on that, nobody really seems willing to say sea level rise is going to be about this. Big storm is going to be about that. And wind or northeast or whatever is going to be about that. I'll tell you that, the probabilities of each of those individually, somewhat. And so one way to think about this might be just postulate a god-awful storm in 2050 and try to measure yourself against that and say, okay, it's 2050, sea level is that. The 10-year or 100-year storm is that, and it adds not 6 inches, which is the current number, but 8 or 9 inches, and just sort of make it up because based on some good judgment, hopefully, but and you've got something to measure yourself against that probably isn't an everyday occurrence.
So the draft, to fill out what Paul was saying, that the draft ordinance that we created before everything got canceled, I mean, we worked all the way through. We had the draft ordinance down to like 95% word. It was minor tweaking. We were taking the FEMA 100 year, taking the mid-level curve from ICC, adding it to that, and then putting an 18-inch freeboard, which is already in the code. And we did not account for fetch or winds, because that becomes, just impossible to determine where the storm is, where its breach is,
I
where
think the thinking of the 18-inch freeboard took some of that. into
right,
consideration.
and that's why 18-inch. And freeboard, the most common number is 18 inches, although it ranges from 12 to 24 in, I think, the surveys that we did. But that 18-inch freeboard is basically uncertainty.
Yeah.
That's what it is. So, we had that. Now, the other thing I'll just throw out so everyone knows is that if you haven't read the AECOM flood study for the city, and that was done based on the upcoming events of Lewes Waterfront Preserve and Fisher's Cove. The study, in my opinion, is very, very good and very flawed. This study is phenomenal, but they do a combination table of precipitation and coastal storms. And they treat them as mutually exclusive variables or independent variables. And that's where the flaw is. I mean, you could take that whole report and with just some minor tweaks, get something really meaningful out of it. But they assume that the 40-inch rainfall doesn't occur with the coastal storm. Well,
When does it occur?
Right.
well,
Yeah.
I mean, we do get more
Hurricanes
Eastern
do
storm,
rain.
but I mean, what's been proven in modern history is that it's hurricanes coming ashore and storming. And so with that minor tweak, the AECOM study, and I fought tooth and nail at the city to get them to update that. And it was a
Who did it? Do you know?
I don't know.
AECOM.
There was
I mean, I was thinking who-
there was a young hydrologist that did most of the work. I can't remember her name.
Yeah.
I can find out. But
Why they would have made that assessment? It's kind of strange.
Well, Savannah was part of that project, but the hydrologist, I can't remember who it was. But anyway, I encourage you to read the AECOM report because it actually is good, because it also talks about soils.
Do we have a copy of that?
It's on the city website.
Okay.
And
Maybe
this, is
send
that
it
on the
out.
city
Yeah.
website or on the BPW website?
Austin, can you send that out?
Yeah.
so
So where does it leave us, I guess? I mean, this is the basis we've got to start from.
I spent a lot of time talking about sea level rise,
Mhm.
but I think given all the assets that you mentioned a little while ago, I hope this group will look beyond sea level rise at
Yeah.
each of the quadrants on the screen here. Because, and when you start thinking about that and you start trying to figure out what to do with some of the sort of challenges of working through this and coming up with relevant numbers that Tom was just talking about, I'm not sure how to do that vis-a-vis your assets. I mean, the other way, and building on what Austin said a few minutes ago about risk management, thinking about this meeting, I was trying to imagine, what's the sort of wiggle room that you have in your assets now, for electrical generation? How much do hotter, longer summers, in terms of heating or cooling degree days, change your the ability for you to deliver?
Yeah, we don't generate, of course, we buy it
Right.
all, but we
But-
distribute, yeah.
I don't have a sense of how that works, but I'm assuming that's an important factor.
There's a lot of other things going on in the power industry right now, like EVs and solar and wind and batteries and
Right.
that are really big issues in the power industry that are also going to be in play. And there was a fellow from Harvard that spoke at the BPPA conference I was at 2 weeks ago. He said, we're trying to go electric. Electrification is the term going forward for all this stuff. But he says, our grid system can't handle it. From what's being projected, we can't handle it. We're not prepared to handle it. So that's with all the problems we have with the grid. That's just adding to it. So that you bring up a good point.
I mean,
it's more than just this stuff. It's
if I would
everything
make a
else that's
recommendation,
happening.
I think we need to do is, and Austin can do it relatively, put together a list of assets in a matrix form and the risks, wind, precipitation, coastal storm. And start there, because, and I think, I'm not sure if everyone is aware, Lewes has one incoming power line.
So that just to add to this, so this adds a whole different complexity, because not only are you looking at your substation and your 69 kV coming in, but you are completely dependent on Delmarva Power from your asset being the 69 kV tie-in point all the way back to the Midway substation. So if anything happens between there and their substation, you're black.
And where are those located?
So you would follow, so the 69 kV tie-in point, if you're going out Savannah Road, right as soon as you cross over the Ebenezer branch on the left-hand side,
Right, I know where that.
and then that line goes out to West Coast, makes a left, goes down out to Route 1 and goes out towards the Wawa, and right next to the Wawa, that's a brand new substation.
So that's the weak link there. between
Yeah, and
those
there's
two
no
sides.
redundancy. So if you
No,
lose,
well, it's, the weak link is from Delmarva, their one line coming in,
That's what I mean.
and from the demarcation point getting to our
Oh,
substation.
Oh, I see, yeah.
We haven't, we're on the end of an extension cord.
You talked to Delmarva about bringing, or did you do?
Well, we both did, yeah.
About bringing another line in, it was crazy.
well, and then you go into the whole point is that there's theoretically, there's no room as it stands right now. So if you go to each one of the substations that they have, there's no additional capacity to tie into to have.
Other
the
than when
redundancy.
you get, I mean, you have to go.
Yes,
out
You're
to
talking about
to-
real estate,
not really, well, that would just be in the existing substation.
saying wire capacity and.
No,
substation
no,
capacity.
real estate. There isn't enough footprint
Okay.
to put in another bank to tie into. That would be separate from that substation. So the ones out on Route 9, all those substations are at capacity. And we looked at putting in or having Delmarva put in an extra substation. And we could not find land that was accessible enough to the transmission system. So, the transmission system, which is kind of outside of our bailiwick, but from the risk side of going black, that is our responsibility. But recognize that we have a major weak link. And it would cost tens and tens of millions of dollars to run a line down to like Route 5 or, and the one that was closer, unfortunately, is landlocked. It has lots of space, but the whole line would have to be undergrounded.
I read recently that undergrounding the lines is not being considered because it's harder to maintain. And does that have to do with the water table, or does it have to do with animals chewing or corrosion or just kind of-
It's multiple things.
Those, I think those are issues, because in fact, I don't think I gave it to you. There's a graphic that shows some of that. But I think it's still probably because of natural storms is a better way to go if we had the options.
So-
The expense, what was the number, was around $1 million a mile
It's over $1 million a mile.
underground?
So, I mean, the last 5 years of my career I spent at GE Transmission and Distribution. I've got a very sordid past.
Yeah.
Undergrounding lines, I mean, it's a couple of, the cost of just actually installing it. Maintenance, these lines are all done visually with infrared drones and everything. Once you go underground, you can't see the size of the lines, once you underground them, go up drastically because they're air cooled above and down below they're in conduit. So the size of the lines becomes increasing. And then the real kicker is in areas like where we are, and not for transmission as much, but like for distribution, is you can underground the lines to reduce your exposure from the poles and the wires. But you still have to come out of the ground, and then your pad mounted transformers are 6 feet in the air.
Right.
To like on the beach side, a lot of the times we put stainless steel transformers in, which are above ground and they're
Well, they're on the poles.
yeah, well, yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But our whole point of that is because if you put them on the ground, as much as it floods over there, they'll be underwater.
Well, and during a storm on the ground, it would take your system out anyway. So, while undergrounding is, there's trade-offs in there, and I'm not saying yes or no.
Yeah.
I'm saying it's not that simple of.
Yeah, again, that same conference, excuse me, that I attended, one of the breakout sessions was on FEMA and HUD and things like that, the funding they can help. And they listed 2 examples where FEMA, undergrounded, I think it was Palm Beach, Florida, and Jackson County, Missouri, preemptively, before they had a storm. And I said to the presenter, how do you do that, And I said, every community along the coastline would want that done. And I think it was politics, obviously. They had to do somebody high enough that that money from FEMA to actually underground the entire community's system.
Well, one of the interesting, and this is where the unanticipated consequences come in, is Florida. They preemptively, after one of the hurricanes, had decided that they were going to harden the lines along the coast. So they went from wood poles to steel or concrete. And then they had a storm come through, and the damage was 10 times worse. And when they started to look into it, the yield curve for a wood pole is very broad. The yield pole for steel, it's an engineered modular elasticity, is peaked. So as soon as you broke that point, everything went down. And they then subsequently undergrounded, or are in the process of undergrounding. But here it was, they decided, and they designed for a Cat 5 storm, but the problem is a Cat 5 storm, you have wind gusts, and a gust came through and everything went tumbling down.
Tom, you started by saying we should prepare a list of assets, and that's true, but don't we have to determine on how we're going to address what the need is? I mean, what the conditions are.
Yeah, I think.
And the condition year, are we going to go with 2015? I did send you just the scope of this long-range plan that we're doing, the wastewater treatment plan. I just gave you the scope itself. I didn't see the whole thing, but that plan for the first option there of hardening the plant, we're using 2050 for that assumption. So it seems like a reasonable year if that's where we want to start.
That's awfully close.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, in all the reading I've done, when you look at sea level rise mitigation planning, 30 years or no, 30 years away is, it's sort of like tomorrow in terms of planning purposes. At least when we were talking about this with the City of Lewes Committee, we sort of put the critical assets aside and focused initially on just the basic housing stock stuff. But my sense is if you're looking at the critical assets, the kinds of things that you listed off, the kinds of things that worry you, I'm assuming you need to look at a longer time frame than 30 years. I think it depends on how long you imagine each of these assets is going to last.
And I think
Well,
that's the
when we
difference.
designed treatment plants, it used to be 20 years, I think it's more like 30 years now. So that's about the life.
Yeah. As I said,
Expected life of the
when-
facility.
when we argued against the short time frame for housing stock, because a house is built, the IRC is based on 100 years. That's what expected housing stock is to last. Some builders more, some builders less, but 100 years. And that's why I thought it was foolish 30 years out. I mean, so on the year 31, all that, but the infrastructure we're talking about has got a useful life.
Okay.
And it's going to have to be replaced regardless of whether it's from storm damage or just age. And technology changes. I mean, where we're at now with directional drilling was not someplace we were even 10, 15 years ago as being cost effective. And I only see that type of stuff becoming more cost effective. And frankly, from distributed electric generation, microgrids, all of that, that's all moving very quickly. And so I think my suggestion would tie it more to the life of the asset.
I think this study was 2015, West Cedar.
You could say something like hardened to 2050 and built to like 2075 or something. Whatever the asset is.
But when the assets are replaced, take something like the wastewater treatment plant, you don't replace the whole wastewater treatment plant, you replace different parts of it at a time, right? Or am I wrong?
Well, sometimes it's major.
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes it's basically rebuilding.
Most often, you're right. And it's often also times that the whole place gets blown up and redone.
I mean, when the plant was upgraded to membrane technology, I mean, basically, it was gutted and replaced. I mean, it's the same part of the same footprint, and what press passed around, what we're looking at now is whether to harden, move, co-locate with the county. That would be.
I don't think I received that.
Well, it was just
This was
an excerpt from
one of the
it.
lower attachments.
I just sent that yesterday. I
Oh,
apologize.
okay.
Yeah,
I didn't listen to
I
it.
just accumulated some documents that I thought we might discuss today.
But you have a design life consideration, right? That plant, new version that's on the Howard Seymour location has a design life, right? But then there's the viability of that in the face of rising waters. I know there's been conversation about the drying beds piece of the problem. So there's a clock ticking on the age of the plant and age of the design perhaps, but then there's also what's going to get it first. Is it going to be rising water
Yeah.
or some other aspect? I don't think we can just look at one or the other. You got to keep it all going. So it may very well be, somebody said this, that you come up with a short-term program that allows you to keep making this work, more frequent fire drills, if you will, to deal with the drying bed issue. But at some point, there's going to come a time in the future when something else is going to have to be done, whether you build up the plant or move the plant out of the flood plain or whatever.
which is what the study that we're having
That's-
to do right
The
now.
study is ongoing now.
And as Mark pointed out, that, when you build a plant, everything, is on the same clock. That plant out there, I mean, we just spent $1.2 putting in new membranes. The clock is restarted and they have a 10 to 15-year useful life on those assets. The EQ tank we're having to have replaced because it's been placed, 30 years now?
At least 20,
25.
yeah.
And, the glass lining is found. So we're gonna replace that. So the 0 point on the clock is all over the place on that plant now.
And we'll probably put equipment in to handle the sludge.
Yeah, belt filter press.
Filter press. Rather than
That's what you're leaning towards, is about the-
I'm assuming as time goes by, as more and more of those things get replaced, the cost of owning that particular machine goes up, right? I mean, it's more and more depreciated, but there's more and more maintenance every year to keep it running, right?
Well, actually, we're kind of probably at a peak of the maintenance now because the equipment is now getting to the end of its useful life and we're replacing it. So thereby, we should hopefully start to see the maintenance curve going down.
So are there any longer term limitations? I mean, how long could you run that plant in its current configuration if the water didn't rise?
I think by doing it piecemeal, like you were saying, I think it's a good one for much longer time.
Okay.
I mean,
And it's
assuming
got
that-
adequate capacity.
Yeah, at adequate capacity. We don't have that much more area to develop to serve anyway, so.
Because you have capacity and Austin's point about, supply chain issues and maybe having more months to spares.
It's very hard to have spare filters because you can store them in glycerin, I think. But what you run into is exactly where you're going is you deal with supply chain issues. Like, I'll give you an example with transformers. You're one hurricane away from really having a problem. Delaware Electric Co-op, they stopped all implementation of new transformers and new developments.
And they get
Delaware Electric
back
Co-op,
up to, we're one hurricane away from.
you're one hurricane away from a serious problem. When it comes to supply chain, just looking at transformers, because you're looking, like right now, I got a quote, 20 transformers, $200,000. It is 34 weeks lead time. But when you have everybody else that's doing the same thing. So for example, if I'm at 34 and somebody else is at 34, then you go and you have one hurricane, then FEMA steps in and takes the allocation that was there and they take it to where the need is.
Whether it be in the Gulf or wherever.
But what Austin has done over the last year or so is we have increased our inventory because we were way short on not only transformers, but water meters, pumps for pump stations, motors for the wastewater treatment plant. Now, you can't have 100% stock for everything because that becomes not cool. So it's a balancing act between
judgment you're making of what you see is possibly coming down and what.
But I mean, and I think many people are doing the same type of thing because frankly, a lot of what we're seeing on the supply chain side is this shift towards just-in-time delivery. I mean, the last couple of years has proven the shortcomings of that. Unless you happen to be sitting in a rowboat off the coast of California, and you can go and get a container.
So some of you have heard my spiel on this. I know Austin and Robin have. I'm going to put it in a slightly different term just to throw another problem that's not on that screen in there. It relates to rising sea level. Every month when you do your monthly report, there's the contractor report on operations and problems and so on. And there's always a graph in there that shows the month's flows by day as well as the precipitation. And if I've read it right, every time we have a storm, we have a higher flow. So I'm going to pose it as a question. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm assuming there's some sort of infiltration into the system. And I'm going to further assume that it's a groundwater infiltration into pipes that are sitting partially submerged in the water table or below the water table. with that lower left-hand rising sea level thing, what we've heard both at BPW and the city is that groundwater levels will rise as sea level rises. So more of the plumbing infrastructure, the sewer infrastructure in the city, not just the storm sewers, that's another problem, but the sanitary sewer system will be underwater. I don't know how susceptible it is to infiltration.
Well, you know, it is, but the good news is that, you know, of course, the old sewer used to be clay, very loose joints and easy to crack.
Every 2 feet.
Yeah, every 2 feet. And all the new stuff's going in is PVC with tight joints, and we're sealing manholes now. So there was someone in town that's been complaining about the flow at the treatment plant, the same it was as it was 10, 12 years ago. How do you, and you tied all these people in? Well, that's because we've tightened the system up and people are using less water too. That's another thing. So yeah, it is getting tighter all the time. And like we have a program to line manholes going down Cedar and with the Kings Highway.
Cedar, King, Polytown Road, and then, you know, even when you're in areas like when you get in tight areas to where it's not necessarily feasible to tear out the whole road and basically box out and rebuild. If we'll camera a sewer line, so let's just say it's terrified, we'll camera it and we'll put it like a CIP liner. And it's basically, in theory, you're putting in a significantly much better structure.
Yeah, going down Bay when they replaced that was all lined and manholes were all lined and so forth. So that's pretty tight now.
So you're already on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're-
So what percentage done are you? Percentage coverage?
So if you look at it, Cedar, we had Cedar Cameron and that's designed. But that,
No, I mean of the whole.
the whole system.
system.
How much clay is still left in there and how much that
I
kind of
don't
stuff?
know.
I don't know what the percentage is, but it's still there. There's still work to be done.
10% left or 10% start?
I'd probably say there's, on the sewer side, you're probably looking 25 to 40% left.
Again, you don't know the condition. It may very well be that most of it's in good shape.
Yes, I mean, what we do is we try and camera everything we can.
I say Cedar's a big project we have coming up.
It's 14 plus million
$14 million.
to do that project with the side streets, 14 plus million.
What
So
are you doing at
we
the
do that-
manholes? Are you relining the manholes or replacing them?
Relining when we can, if not, then we replace.
Because as I was saying with press earlier, with the rise in water levels that we're seeing in some of these charts, that water is liable to go saline, and that saline water will damage activated sludge sewage treatment plant faster than anything. What you can watch under a microscope what it does to the microbes when salt water hits a sewage treatment plant, and you can build walls all around it and put in new sludge, but you get salty water into a treatment plant, it's a whole different ball.
And Bob and Sumner have heard this. I mean, we had dead reckoning, and we've had back on planning commission, we had workshops, and you know, one of the other aspects to what you just mentioned is it completely can change the condition of the marshes and the trees. You know, what is out on
You're saying salinity.
salinity, yeah. The rising water table, and you know, because right now there's a balancing act between the fresh water and the salt water from the ocean. And as you get more head, that is shifting. And you know, many places, I mean, the mangrove, I mean, you see it all over where the coastal flora is dying off because it can't.
It's not made for salt.
It may be good for brackish, but you know,
Right.
it's a very, very fine tipping point.
That's exactly
So
right.
we're so dependent on marshes here.
Yeah.
And even the marsh, when we had it studied out after the spill,
The marsh at the plant.
the plant, by the plant,
It's not a root.
it's amazing actually, even within there, because there's actually kind of a berm that goes through the middle of it, the old
Where you
railroad
can
bed.
walk out to the canal, that berm? where it
No,
follows the
no,
pipe?
actually, if you look at it from an aerial perspective, there's a curved berm from where the old railroad went through there, where it went out
okay.
to Queen Anne Pier. And it has separated them to two different ones, completely different
I'll be darned.
flora, or not completely, but I mean, the species change and the percentage is amazing. It's, and to the eye, when you walk around, you think it's marsh.
Well, I also think,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry,
Go
it
ahead.
just made me think about the, depending on the levels of rise and whatnot, if any work has been done on keeping salt water away from your well field as well. Of course. And I know it's back a ways, and the water is going to be higher inland also, whether that is a control.
No,
But a
and-
geologic study probably would be worthwhile.
You haven't already done it.
Start.
Austin, you wanna start this one off? Or?
So one of the things that DENREC has pushed, because on the funding side, they pushed for emerging contaminants, and that's like PFAS, PFOs. Well, one of the things, we actually had testing done in September of 21, and we're very fortunate in that our well field, I mean, the water that comes out of there is absolutely terrific. If you look at a map, which shows kind of a heat map of like locations where you could put it, whoever picked that location should honestly be sitting next to Bill Gates. You cannot pick it, and it's very hard because, we looked at alternative sites for a well field, and it's not too feasible local wise. I mean, if you look on the new road side, that's where we were looking, it's not, because then you start to get into Canary Creek.
Mhm.
And our wells are fairly shallow. I mean, you're looking anywhere from 80 to 85 to 110 feet.
If I recall, they do go through a clay lens, so.
So
That's not continuous, and that's the problem, is that it
Well,
all
that's
moves
just-
around. Yeah, there's no firm layers.
Okay.
so we started the process of engaging in a conversation with DENREC, and that had to do a lot with the development that's happening around the well fields. And we purchased the Jones Farm in an act to preserve that area. But once you started to have the Mitchell property, you had the village center, you have the cottages of the village center, you have the remaining 35 acres that would be developed, or what future development would happen.
Don't leave Kings Highway out of it.
And then you have the Kings Highway corridor dualization. So we engaged in a conversation with DENREC, and a lot of it had to do with the most recent wellhead protection study was in 2003. When we engaged them, we had said, hey, is this something that you would, what's your trigger for doing this again? Their trigger was actually adding an additional well. It's not necessarily increasing your production or your capacity of that well. It's if you go and add a sixth well, they would do it.
Never mind all the other changes that have occurred in the water, watershed.
So that's exactly what we said. And so we were given a proposal that they went back to DGS, and DGS is Delaware Geological Society. They came back with a proposal, it was roughly $77,000, then recreationally offered a 10% contribution. And so we moved forward with that. But the other piece, and I don't know if you want to share it, was when the village center was coming through the pipe, there was actually a condition from the village center that DENREC would work with the applicant.
That DENREC had to provide. So the original village center, the 300,000 square foot Bahamut, when it was denied, but they did change the zoning. So they disapproved the development, but they approved the zoning change. And one of the
For
notes.
75,000 square foot.
Well,
Commercial
yeah,
space.
when they changed it to B1, yeah, to the 75,000 community.
Right on the corner.
It said that there would be 2 plan reviews required with public comments, and that a DENREC wellhead delineation update had to be provided. Now, that was 2016, 16.
15 or 16. I think it was 16.
So the village center has kind of been put on hold at this point. But in Mitchell Farm, we have the same issues, and they proposed conditions, and actually you were at the last meeting on this one, so.
And the conditions were basically Hans's conditions that he worked with us.
Hans is the
What
county engineer.
county engineer. We talked to him prior to all this, and he said, what would you like to see happen? What do you think is necessary? And he listened to us. And basically, he adopted most of everything that we requested. And at the last meeting, he submitted that to the council for consideration. So they made no decision to evaluate.
So
Hans's
one of the things that
recommendations.
does have is, it has monitoring wells at the Mitchell Farm stormwater management field for contamination, road salt, the bottle. But we independently, before that, had decided we were gonna, it was recommended to us from doing right. And DGS to put in a monitoring well between the well field and the Ebenezer branch. Because as sea level rise increases, the salinity of the branch is going to, and I mean, it's, you know, right there.
Yeah.
So that's something we also have in progress is a monitoring well.
Did you ever make the connection that we put in? They had to put a stub out there to the entrance. Was that ever connected
To
to
Tidewater?
To Tidewater?
Yeah,
It did make that
That's
connection.
We not only,
emergency connection.
Yeah.
so we have that emergency connection, but we also discussed because the redundancy on the opposite side of town with a well, but the well on that side of town, not only was it a very low producing well, it wasn't nearly as good, and that's from a water quality standpoint. So as the construction on New Road was going in, we actually put a 24-inch casing across New Road in anticipation that we could also do a connection with Tidewater. So that provides redundancy on both sides of town. So if something happened at the canal, where the Canary Creek crossing is, when Delta does the final connection, when the bridge happens, we have the ability, we can shut a valve right there and turn Tidewater on. So that's your kind of your risk mitigation on that side. Until we have a connection between both sides of town, with the split being the Miller Farm, that would be redundancy.
Yeah.
Well, we started by saying, let's try to identify conditions that we're going to design to. Where are we with that? But, I mean, I've heard some comments that maybe that you may have to revisit that or reconstruct it somehow.
Well,
Or
so
redefine it maybe.
I mean, you have a bunch of different assets. So I'm assuming each of the different assets sort of has and it was complicated just to talk about the sewer plant, but each of them has sort of a different lifespan and life cycle that we would want to protect for the city. And then there's the, like somebody said about cost, there's also the cost factor. I don't know how you work up that schedule, but it seems to me we figure out how far out we need to go to be reasonable or to protect the assets and so on. For city, that will determine the numbers, right? And it starts with 8 years, right? What year into the future do we need to protect for if there are changes that can be predicted? I don't know if do you want to go to situational things? I mean, the hotter, longer summer, I don't really have a sense of how that affects things, but I can drum up several scenarios where that might be an issue. One thing we haven't talked about is every year, more and more of the landscape around here gets paved. So every year, I'm assuming the temperature of the area is going up faster than whatever predictions would be made for the area just based on climate, because we're warming up the area. I don't know if it's a factor. I'm just saying, you know, urban heat island effect, and they'll have Haven and albedo and all that.
And I have no idea here because we have such a coastal influence, if that really is or isn't. I don't know. I mean, Philadelphia, Washington, New York, I mean, obviously they do. But whether it impacts us, but it's kind of, that is, my thoughts are is that, you know, if you're gonna take this, you know, from a piecemeal basis, or, you know, that are independent from each other. You know, the critical things are wind, water, those type of risks. The, yeah, that's done in the water, you know, water from above, water from below, water from the coast, you know.
But Tom, you talked about independent, you, in your first remarks, I think one of the biggest challenges, the synergistic effects is, you know, when things get bad is when they start piling up simultaneously.
Well, but like on the heat effect, I mean, it drives up air conditioning and so on and so forth. However, from all the studies in the industry, the electrification of the economy overshadows those numbers by multiples. So the real risk to our sustainability from an electric perspective is the crystal ball of when does Cape Henlopen go to electric buses? And where are they going to charge? What's going to be the adoption rate of EVs at home? Those type of things grossly overshadow the fact that the temperature goes up 1.5 degrees Celsius and you run your air conditioning more. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's just that from, you know, the big bucks are there.
So that kind of gets, I haven't been able to say this properly. That gets to the question I tried to pose earlier. What percent fluctuation, increase, decrease in demand for power kicks off, you know, a real problem for the BPW? You know, what kind of latitude do you have in your operations? Right?
So we had a study done by Sergeant Lundy about 3 years ago. And they looked at as much as they could, because we don't have any in line, but on a distribution lines, what?
Explain it.
Automatic. It's real-time reading of the meters so that you know what every household is using by time of day. And it allows you to determine whether the local pole transformer that's feeding 4 houses is overloaded or not. We have metering on the circuits. We have 4 circuits in town. So they kind of had to look at it from a high level and kind of do some magic to try to interpolate. But what that study showed is that we're reaching the point where, like the substation, the big assets, the transformers are not going to be 100% redundant. And that's the design basis. So that would mean that if you had a failure of a transformer, the other transformer could not, we'd have to go through blackouts, brownouts, cycling. But in general, the condition of the electrical assets, I was surprised that was quite good. And they put in there a number, and I don't remember what it is, but like 20% adoption of EVs, which came from an industry forecast back 3 years ago. Now, obviously, that's changed.
That's accelerated.
That's accelerated, but there still was margin. So I'm not as concerned, other than with the transformers at the substation and the fact that those are not things you can stock. And the commonality between utilities is limited because they have to be impedance matched. I mean, they're designed for, and the lead time of those things historically was always half a year, 3/4 of a year, and are over 16 months now. Assuming that there's no tornado outbreaks in the Midwest, no fires in the far west, and, you know, so from that perspective, I don't think we're pushing capacity limits of either the wastewater treatment plant nor of the electrical distribution. Now, on a localized level, we may be, but not on holistic.
I can share that report.
Yeah, I mean, we've actually done, a fair amount of studies from credible organizations on these things to address them. But, anything you want to poke holes in, feel free.
I'm just asking questions,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Okay, good question. But getting back to the initial question, I mean, how do we address this? There's these four major factors. Are we gonna try to put something together, and are we gonna use what's already been produced? And do we go to 50 years rather than 30 years? There's probably more data for 30 years than there is for 50. And most projections that have been being done right now, including ours, are good for 50. So you have to pick, because I don't think we should go back and try to reinvent the wheel here.
Chris, I've heard of a group at the university, you may already know about this. Just got wind of it a couple of days ago. There's a lady and lives in my development who works at the university down here. She's overseeing some group that is looking at impacts of climate and whatnot. Her name is Swallow. Her last name is Swallow. Do you know?
Yeah.
yeah, she used
You
to.
know more than I
Seagrant.
do.
Yeah,
Okay.
she was.
She may be a source of some of this information.
And she is more than willing to chip in anyway.
Okay. I have not talked to her, but I just heard that she's.
Yeah.
She was
Interact with her a lot.
Oh, okay, good.
She's a great resource. She's
big guidance on it when we did sea level rise.
Okay.
She's always, she was part of the Lewes Executive Committee on
Oh, I'm glad to hear
resiliency.
this. Okay,
And,
good.
but Daniel Swallow is a phenomenal resource.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that maybe some of our answers are already in place that we may have.
But I imagine she's probably been involved in the development of this at some point.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
But I think she's involved in still in the mitigation plan for the city.
Yeah.
I think she comes in.
Actually, that
No, the mitigation committee, yeah.
Yeah, I
She's,
think-
she's a,
Mitigation.
she's a standard
Yeah.
member of that.
Okay,
To the city side.
okay, great.
So how much should we be piggybacking what they've developed? Are they at a point that we feel comfortable picking that up? And because that would be the most logical thing to do if we're satisfied that that's,
Sea Grant.
no, the city,
Yeah,
city
how
is
far
that-
along is that? Are they,
Well,
No,
it's a
they
continuous
disbanded.
process. No, we're talking about two different things. The thing that Robin's referring to is the mitigation committee, which has been meeting for years. I don't know when it started.
I can't remember exactly when it
but-
started.
I don't know if it started with the Quinn report back in, 2015 or something like that, but there's a bunch of different people in the city sort of looking at different pieces of the puzzle, like, they're looking at,
But they're not looking at any of this.
they're
they're
not,
not,
I don't think they're,
everything mitigating.
Frag.
Frag,
yeah,
Oh,
frag.
Okay, and they discovered, for
Frag.
example, that their first idea of a command center was the fire department.
Yeah, the
No,
EOC.
And they had to move it to Cape and Logan because they figured it would become an island.
it's in the flood zone.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
That's
they-
not what you're talking
and
about.
they do own the plan for post hurricane. We do the drill with every couple of years stuff. But it was specifically when sea level rise was formed at a planning commission by the city. It was because mitigation was too diffused. So I mean,
Well, where did the sea level rise committee that's now defunct, what did that end? Did it come up with anything that?
yeah, we
build
can
on?
share. I thought I'd share with you.
I wasn't meant to be funny.
Don't let us get political.
Oh,
Yeah, we like I said, we were have 95% of our draft ordinance written.
but it was the first step.
Yeah.
In, I think, covering some of the things that you've got on the screen here. That was a very specific piece of the overall puzzle that, given the assets that you're responsible for, that we would need to.
Yeah,
And it was really
address.
more aimed, I'm sorry, Paul, it was really aimed more at
building and zoning.
building and
Well, I can
zoning
understand
to
that.
prevent to mitigate risks down the line. It was not about protecting current. But it did have a section in it where it was going to require increased pervious, as I described earlier, the elevation.
But did it settle on a year?
Yeah.
And is that what
I'll
we should
send it
build
to
on?
you because I want this wrote the draft.
Is there any, but my question is, does that address what we're trying to resolve now? Of what target we should be shooting for, and what the numbers are?
So I think the reasoning was based on what Tom said earlier. I don't remember the acronym you used, but you know, if you think about a building having a lifespan of about 100 years, I think we were looking at 2100 as a time horizon, and considering those numbers. But you know, obviously, you're looking at the whole curve between here and there.
If I remember correctly, Bob, you were better, because there was a section that was talking about critical assets, and there was a section that talked about just general. And the general curve we were forced into, I don't think any of us willingly agreed to it, was 30 years out mid-level curve forecasting, which to me was a farce because, I mean, so you can get a 40-year mortgage, but your house is only going to last for 30 years. And then the critical infrastructure had a higher, and that was to cover things like cell phone.
50 or 70.
Yeah, I don't remember what we finally settled on.
I could send it to you.
Okay, it sounds like
Okay,
you got,
but I think it is fair to say that it was focused on the building part of that. And on the screen here, the two things that you can really address are rising sea level and increased precipitation. And you know, 2050 to 2070, whatever you pick. Can we harden and design for those kinds of things?
So you know, it's not like magically these trends are going to stop in 30 years. I guess the way I look at this is first things first. Let's, you know, focus on the nearer term, 30 years or whatever, but keep in mind while we're discussing things and making plans, and ultimately there will be bigger challenges down the road. You know, they may require a wholesale redesign of a plant or whatever, but 30 years is probably the right, given everything I've heard, 30 years may very well be the right time frame for now. But just, we all need to keep in mind that it doesn't magically stop
yeah.
in 2050.
Right.
You know, the problems from all of the data that are behind these charts here, you know, Tom has referred to acceleration. All of the curves show an acceleration in things like sea level rise, and I believe temperature is in there as well. So you know, if we can figure out how to handle 2050, and what does it say, 9 to 23 inches? I mean,
Yeah.
I think the midterm, and when we did the planning commission sea level rise committee, that was based on the second to last set of numbers, new set of numbers that come out. I think that suggests that, you know, over the last 100 years, there's been about a foot of sea level rise. In the next 30 years, we will have an additional foot of sea level rise. And so, you know, somewhere in there, I don't know the exact number, but that's acceleration. You know, and that's no small task. I mean, look, the other day we had, and it's never as easy as, and this is one of the things that Danielle really proved to me in the very many presentations she's made to the city over the last couple of years. It's never as simple as just, we need to keep in mind, it's a lot more complicated than just the sea level going up, because as that water goes up, every storm that comes in is higher, right? Everything that happens, you think of as an addition to that rising sea level. So through time, there will be, as the water's going up, higher and higher frequency of things that have caused problems to us in the past, right? The frequency of a 1962 storm or Winter Storm Jonas will go up over the 30 years in front of us. You know, the frequency of a storm that puts water across part of Cedar Street, that will go up. You know, it'll be a higher frequency.
This study talks a lot about that.
Yeah.
It's really,
Does it talk about,
yes, I just got it.
does it talk about the decrease in population due to the storms and the decrease in demands for, I'm thinking wastewater?
Doesn't get into that. I don't believe, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question, because
You get a
I mean,
couple of
everything-
feet out there and.
everything I see, well, so again, talking about Danielle and the people with whom she's worked with, you know, they always mention at some point this concept of retreat, you know, the R word. It's a,
Oh, my.
who wants to deal with that? But there will come a time when it's going to be more and more difficult to continue as we have in certain parts of the city.
If you have flooding every month rather than
Right,
once a year,
right.
that's,
Actually, somewhere I've seen a population curve of the 5 miles from the coast. And it is doing nothing but increase.
Right, and that was where I was headed.
I mean, the population in the center of the country is going down, and the population of the east and west coast and this narrow band is going up.
Right.
And, you know, it's a microcosm. Just look around here.
Yeah,
I
sure.
mean, it's, the only thing I'll mention about the top ones is that while we can't control them, and I'm not sure that we're necessarily as much at risk, but they are very large issues in the utility infrastructure.
Sure.
It's line droop. And we've seen a lot of forest fires caused by lines drooping in the hot temperatures, you know, because I mean, when you start getting 120, 130, 140 degrees, and even subterranean assets with expansion, you know, the road buckling, the expansion of line. So I don't know that it's something that we need to tackle, but even those do have a potential impact on us.
So you talked about coastal mitigating effects, you know, that I'm assuming something you said earlier, Tom, you know, if we were worried about temperatures being by the coast, obviously the water is helping to moderate whatever increases we get. But the fact is, from what you said earlier, Austin, we get our power from lines that cross an interior part of the Delmarva Peninsula, where there will be more, I'll say, aggressive swings in temperature. You know, perhaps more frequent higher temperatures. I don't know if they'll get to the thresholds where lines are drooping.
Luckily,
so-
Delaware's got teeny trees and not big trees.
I'm not many forests,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
And they cut swaths through. So I'm my gut tells me I'm not too concerned about the main transmission lines, other than the fact that there's one main line that goes north.
I don't remember if in that upper right, well, the two top quadrants there, whether there was talk about, you know, increased demand for air conditioning, you know, in the hotter parts of the days, and how that affects the grid. I mean, you and I have talked a little bit about some of the challenges for this area, getting enough juice down the line. You know, with more and more houses coming in at the rates that we're all witnessing, looking around, and with temperatures going up, that means more and more air conditioners running more of the time. Yes,
Yeah.
they're getting more efficient through time. I don't know how that works out.
Well, the other thing on that to that point is the solarization of the areas actually exacerbates what you're talking about, because about 4 o'clock midsummer, the sun has gone down far enough that the efficiency of the cells is like 60% of what they are. Which is also the corresponding peak where people come home and crank up the air conditioning.
And plug your car in.
So what the industry sees is that, you know, there always was a peak like this. And that peak is broader because now you've got the solar coming off, so it broadens it, and higher because of that. And you then throw in EVs. And down here, once again, I'm not quite sure how it's gonna work, but in cities, people come home from work, plug their EVs in, and if they're not on time of day use, you get that coincident peak. Now, down here, since no one farts and no one works.
That's down.
Yeah, so there are all these things that, and the industry does not have any visibility. I mean, the crystal ball, it's not,
You're trying to shut off somebody's EV till 11 o'clock at night, but you're trying to run their air conditioner, so you need, you know, a level of instrumentation that doesn't
well, that's where,
exist.
that's where AMI
Yeah,
comes
into
in,
that.
and the ability, to, and, because then you have time of day use rates, which would incentivize people, and it's, you know, it's really like 7 o'clock where it starts to taper off, and you can start turning EVs back on. Or, you know, offsetting thermostats by 1 or 2 degrees.
To get that to you, Preston, and trying to define scope. I think 2050 maybe, 30 years may be reasonable, I agree, but let's look at worst case, not a range of 9 to 23 inches, but maybe look at 24 inches, worst case, because we know it's accelerating. So if we're looking at, in that margin, the critical assets, that margin of safety we need, the fact that everyone else is planning around that middle curve drives me crazy. I mean, that they're such optimists.
That's a really, really good point. Everything I've read suggests that more as the asset that you're considering becomes more critical, your tolerance for risk goes down. So you should be using the highest curve, right? You want the minimum probability of reaching whatever those numbers are. So you want those higher sea level rise figures or temperatures or whatever.
And there are communities that have decided to go with 100% curve for building codes and everything. So you know those 3 curves, it's the 25, 50, and 100% 75% probability curves.
We're gonna use the red line, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's one of the other things to your point, Barbara, that, you know, other communities are considering. And
In our little sea level rise subcommittee, we use the middle curve because the city council had picked it 5, 6, 7 years ago.
And that's the thing, I mean, in these discussions, we're literally having the discussion that nobody else wants to talk about. And so that's the, when you forecast out for 24 inches, that's like saying, you know, in 30 years, you're gonna have PFOAs, you gotta find another water source. It's saying single point of failure, you lose the force main underneath the canal, what are you gonna do? And that's what motivated our discussion of mutual aid on the wastewater side and thinking forward on the water side, having tie-ins with Tidewater, because at the end of the day, you just want to have everything in place when shit hits the fan, you know where you're gonna go, what valve you're gonna turn. And I think that's one of the things that
You just went out over the internet. Didn't you?
yeah.
are you referring to our water system, or
It's everything. I mean, you think about,
that was a joke?
As uncomfortable as this, somebody's got to do that.
yeah, I mean, and nobody wants to, like, single point of failure on the electric side, single point of failure on the wastewater side, on the water side. It's, nobody wants to talk about it, which makes it harder because now we're talking about it.
Right.
And just another basic fact, so there's two delineations around the well field. One's called the wellhead protection area, and the other one is the excellent recharge area. The wellhead protection area is somewhat arbitrarily chosen because, and it's calculated by a 5-year transit time from when you pour the oil on the ground to your screen. So there's nothing magical about it other than porosity of the soils and distance and things like that. It doesn't mean that you can or cannot place things on it. The excellent recharge area has to do with replenishing the aquifer.
But those, my understanding of the excellent recharge area delineations that are out there was as an input to the delineation as well as the delineations for all the other wellheads around the area. Delaware Geological Survey evaluated the geological resources and basically classified them in terms of their ability to recharge the aquifer, regardless of whether it was a wellhead area.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So
I mean,
they just classified the sort of the ability, the superficial geology to transmit water deeper into the system.
To the specific aquifer though.
It's not tied to these wellhead areas.
No, not to the wellhead, but the larger.
Yeah, just the general, just how well do things on the surface get into things in the ground? That's basically what that excellent recharge.
And so you're right, because it includes irrigation wells, your neighbors' wells, everything else, so.
But it's also that whole excellent recharge thing was all about general protection of groundwater, right? Just to make this painfully clear, unlike northern Delaware, that has a mixture, and many other parts of the country can rely on a mixture of surface water intakes and groundwater intakes to supply its domestic drinking water. We do not have that luxury. We must get our water from the groundwater because it's the only place that's fresh enough that we can draw. So that's why groundwater protection is so important here.
Darren used to encourage everyone to drink from our effluent and wastewater treatment. I mean, those membranes are used for water treatment also, so. I don't suggest it.
But
Did you read about the beer that's being made from?
Oh, what's the name of it? That's the important.
So to Tom's
It's gotta
point,
be
though,
catchy.
I don't know about how arbitrary it is, but somehow a
Yeah.
determination was made about a 5-year time of travel. There are other communities in similar hydrogeological terrains that would use different times of travel as the threshold for evaluating. You know, it gets to risk. How much time do we want between when things are contaminating the aquifer and when they get to the wellhead and they're into our system? You know, that's sort of a decision for BPW, for the city. You know, in New Jersey, in similar hydrogeological terrains, they use 10-year time travel. I'm not advocating for a particular change here. I'm just saying that's another consideration.
Yeah, just so I clear it right. Arbitrary is probably the inappropriate word, but it was, my understanding of the way that was chosen was that 5 years would give you adequate time to mitigate, ameliorate, find alternatives to the wells once a spill was determined.
So I think building on something that Darren said before Austin, but Austin is now saying is, we're lucky that whoever it was that chose this location did do it here.
Here.
It may not be easy or possible to simply replace these wells if these wells go down.
And just to piggyback on that, then you start to get into a whole nother discussion, which has been brought up with DENREC, is that you have the ordinance within the city that says you do not have any wells, right? So if anybody comes forward and says, I want to put a well in, other than if you're doing geothermal, you can't do it. You step outside and, for example, you go to Tower Hill, and that's where we were looking at putting a production well. If you put a production well in Tower Hill, 294 homes can have an irrigation well, or what they deem as an ag well. So then you're fighting a whole different value, because is there, when you look at where the wells are now, they're in the sweet spot. If you move, does it make sense to move them closer to town or farther away from town? If it's farther away from town, your benchmark is where the city line is. You move them farther out, if you're near subdivisions, the county allows irrigation, what we deem as irrigation well, what they deem as an ag well, to be right next to it.
And everyone is aware the wells sit outside the city limits of Lewes. That is county land, and we can't annex it because the high school's in between us.
And so we sparked that conversation up because there used to be a working group that talked about the very thing that we're talking about on the water side. And that's dealing with Sussex Shores, us, Rehoboth, everybody that's on the coast that gets Bethany, that has their wells so close to saltwater intrusion, and what that end game is.
Well, and what Barbara said earlier, I mean, given how hard it would be to find, I mean, just what you said in this whole conversation on Tower Hill and a new road, a new well, whatever. We don't really have any other places to move other than to possibly interconnect one day and depend on Tidewater. By the way, Tidewater doesn't have some magical place they're getting
I was
water,
gonna
they're
say
getting
the
it
same
from the
thing.
same place.
Yeah, it's the
So
same
we're all in the
pond.
same boat. It's critical that we do everything we can to protect these resources because there aren't any better ones out there. So I don't know if that suggests a longer time of travel or at least some more conservative understanding of the importance of this wellhead area and the, you know, the broader area that supplies water to this, right? But I mean, if you look at the analysis that's behind that blue line on that map, you know, the ultimate area that generates water for this, for these wells is a much bigger area. It just takes longer for that water to get there. How far up?
Yeah,
should we work?
I'm not sure that it's within our bailiwick to
Getting
go
that,
to.
yeah.
No, I'm not saying we
Yeah.
should.
Well, as much as
Yeah.
I would, you know, would
But I
be
think,
interested, that's a state regulation. There's no way, unlike we could choose our own building heights. The wellhead protection area is state delineated, and we can't say it's larger. And on top of it, it's the county.
somewhere, in our deliberations as we go forward, I mean, treatment has to be discussed at some point, if we do get contamination, because we can't just, like you said, find new wells a mile away or something. So I think that's something we're gonna have to talk about, plan for.
Right. Because
So we settled on that, the 50-year plus higher end.
30, you were talking about 30
I mean,
years, but
30,
using the higher
20,
curve.
I meant
That's the higher end.
I meant to say 2050.
Yeah.
And I guess the next thing, like somebody said, you said, we should prepare a list of assets. And I think that's, if Austin, if you could, Robin, kind of try to identify who we all would think about. If you could start putting them together.
We could use for life, is that, and the risks, or do we add the
That's-
risks as a group?
Well, let's get the list first and
Yeah,
see what
yeah.
it looks like. I mean, Mark and I were talking earlier, but the water system's probably the easiest because it's a pressurized system and it's not as prone to damage. Most of it's underground and that type of thing. Sewer system is probably one of the toughest.
You're saying in terms of infiltration or something like that along the
Drinking water,
lines.
yeah, it's pretty much a closed system that, and it's protected because it's underground for the most part, so that's probably the easiest one. It has its issues, but the sewer system itself is gonna be a tough thing. How we're gonna do that? It's power, as we've talked, and the stormwater, that's something different. All at last, and that's, they're trying to approach it. In this report, I think they've done a pretty good job.
But that's one piece of the,
That's one
City.
small piece, that's just that one part of Cedar that they're talking about.
Oh, so
the phenomenon.
Yeah, that's the Cedar report.
the process that they outline, sort of the thinking that they apply there, I mean, basically you could draw up an elevation map of the rest of the city and figure out how it will play out in other parts of the city.
I thought the process was great.
How soon will this GHD?
60 days, it was 90 days total.
Yeah, I think their goal I want to say it was September, beginning of October for the final report.
That's gonna be an interesting thing. I mean, it would be great if we could pick the plan up and move it across town. There's no across town that you could put it. There's no place you can, that's what they're looking at right now.
Big field next to those water belt wells right there.
No,
Yeah.
Delvin's putting a stormwater management facility in.
See the little box in that Jones farm, that's for a water tank. That right there, that was part of the deal. Put a new elevated tank, that location.
We need to draw 5 more traffic circles on there.
That's gonna be changing a
I
lot.
hear they're up to 7.
This is a pretty up-to-date area.
Yeah, it's,
Actually, seriously, they're considering another one, at least another one. Jeez.
So if Austin, if you could look at
I think
the assets and list them.
So I have a goofy way of looking at these things, and I'm sorry for this.
Okay.
Given that kind of time frame, my sense is you also have to think, I mean, the risk, the sort of
Time frame for
determination of, well, sorry, the determination of risk, you know, the problem of failure of one of these assets is dependent on how, I'm assuming at some point in the calculus, it's dependent on how many people are tied to this thing. You know, how many people's houses, their electricity, their cooling, their water, their sewer are dependent. We've touched on it, but never really talked about it. You know, the city at least, and maybe BPW is always in this discussion about annexation. You know, how much will the customer base grow? And
that's been calculated into all the studies we've done with wastewater treatment capacity and electric. We looked at potential annexation and open space and, you know, put fudge factors in for those. So I'm
Yeah,
not
you have an
saying, I'm
alternate
not saying it's
service area,
100%, but it was our best guess of what, you know, with the future, we looking at the city boundaries, the 2-mile municipal area around, and how much of that really was annexable, and just using how many EDUs, like for wastewater, for the wastewater treatment plant and electric.
Yeah, our charter allows us to go out 2 mile. And but most of that's already taken up.
Yeah, most of their
Tidewater's
CPC areas
there, or
too.
the county's there for sewer, you know, co-ops there for power, so most of it's already spoken for. So we have very limited growth.
so your market is what your market is. It's not.
Well, a little bit, there's a few that are probably right for us, but nothing major.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's some farms that potentially would annex in, but that's already been calculated into the projection. I might know he's saying we're pristine, but we did the best we could with. And Janelle had input into that.
I think this is a good start. We should probably actually go down now with 2050 at the upper current means to everything. And have that discussion at our next meeting about, along with the assets that we're worried about. We want to have how soon do you want this?
Well, you're not gonna be on it. You're not gonna say you're gonna be away.
To the 19th.
Yeah,
But-
so how far
It's one
towards
point
Hemlock
press.
does
I press
sewer
the chair.
district go?
So,
Just to there.
yeah, but they're actively in discussions about bringing their sewer service down this way.
You're right.
So the map you're looking at is the sewer boundary map. So here you got, this is Old Orchard Road. So it actually stretches out, and then the railroad track is Continental Divide.
Yeah, I see it.
On the
I can see
water,
I can see the wells are just outside of
What's
it.
your feeling for meetings? How often should we have?
and then right here
Well, the
is
resolution says we need 4 meetings.
A year?
Yeah, but
right?
you could do more.
Yeah.
Mhm.
right here is the water kind of bit right there.
I hope we're
But
doing
so
more
like
than
if anybody,
Yeah.
I give you an example of Tower Hill.
Especially if it's-
We actually had to go to the CPC and request that because it's an unaccounted for parcel.
I see. I see.
And then the electric pretty much follows that red line in the city boundary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Towards the end of the month, we think?
Oh, that sounds good.
Or you can sometime at the end of the month.
Yes. Wednesday again?
Wednesday's good for me.
Good for me. Fridays are for goals.
27th, that's the day of our board meeting, but that's not till 4 o'clock. Is nine a good time or
Can we do the third?
third?
Yeah.
Are you going by then?
No, I'm good. I can do that.
Okay. Yeah, that's better for me too. I thought you could go. Is 9 o'clock or is 9:30? 9:30?
Which day are you talking about?
The third? No, we're talking about the third now.
Do we have any homework?
Think about what we've discussed today. And we'll dig up the conditions that what we've agreed to. We'll produce and a list of assets. So start thinking about.
And then background documents.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you're interested, so behind that state planning process, there are a bunch of other documents that they compiled, some of which are, I've never even looked at.
Anything you have,
Yeah.
that would be great. Anything anybody has.
I think the challenge is with all these different kinds of assets, the problem can be different enough. You know, what you're dealing with electrical planning and mitigation may be very different than water or sewer, stormwater stuff.
Yeah, I think I would urge, because I think it's got to be asset dependent, both from usable life and from. And that's why I think that matrix of eventually developed that would be helpful.
Austin, can you bring up the list that Sharon and Robin put together? This was, I asked them, literature research, just to see what's happened. So there's things from EPA. These haven't been reviewed yet. These are just possible links that we might be looking at from different organizations that seem to apply to.
One of these things in here was actually a link to a whole series of webinars. The first introductory one just happened, but the other 4 haven't happened yet.
Oh, there it
It
is.
looked really good. I think it's that DRWA one.
Yep. And then there was even a tool that we could pretty much fill out, and it would kind of give you a risk assessment of what's going on within the facilities.
So I just looked at that this morning. Is there, can we sign up for that and participate in that?
Again, this is the first time these guys dug it up for us.
I
So-
don't think it costs anything, and I think it's open to the public, so.
I guess that's some other homework, as many as you, of these that you could look at, comment on.
And there, Tom mentioned the AECom thing. Do we need to convey that over? I mean,
Yeah.
it's on the Lewes
Well,
website. You can do a search
Austin's
on
gonna-
it, get it.
Austin's gonna send it out to us, the link to it.
Which one, the AECom?
Yeah.
I got the AECom, Sergeant Lundy, the CAP report, and then I'll send the committee resources out to, just again, so everybody has.
And I'll send you the sea level rise draft.
Would-
And,
Why don't you send it to Austin, he can be our center point to,
and then, I had another one I sent you last night, which is really Saunders University of Hawaii study on
Well, we've looked at it in here.
daily flow.
So, yeah, there's some really cool, and I'm happy to share all those resources with Austin again. There are some really useful visualization tools that have been put together by NASA of all
really,
agencies. And in there, they hook to a University of Hawaii program that looks at visualizing flood frequencies. So you actually have the ability of saying, okay, I know something about the threshold that matter to me, right? Property level, I know that I can accommodate water up to an elevation of
But you just
7 feet above now the 88.
to Lewis.
Right, no, but it actually has a database built into it that allows you to specify a number of locations around the US, including Lewis. It has all the data that are out there at the ferry dock built into it, and the modeling that's been done based on all those data and the predictions for sea level rise. So it will allow you to look at how often water of a certain height is likely to be in Lewis, you know, in the year 2030, 2035, 2040, 2070, whatever you want. You know, you can there's a bunch of different ways of doing it. I'll put something together and share with you.
and anybody has anything else they want to share.
And
But
something
if you give
personally
it
up,
to us,
there's only one FEMA flood gauge for us, and that is what you just said. And the city has been talking about for years now, working with DENREC, DelDOT to get flood gauges on the canal and other places.
Well,
And it's never moved forward.
so from a sea level standpoint, you know, you talked about fetch before. I used to live down off of Cedar, right in that area that's in the West Cedar study is.
Did you
And
move because of the neighbors?
he wasn't close enough.
but my personal observations, and I think this would be borne out with whatever data we could throw at it, is that whatever's going on the ferry dock, the place where all the long-term NOAA station is, you know, that's one thing. But when you have water being pushed against the Delaware Bay shore, particularly around Lewis, and it gets through Roosevelt Inlet, and it gets stored back in the Great Marsh and in the canal system, it's related to what's going on out there in front of Delaware Bay, but it gets confounded by coming through Roosevelt Inlet. I've been trying to make the case for years now that we need to have a better understanding of just how different that is. I don't know how much of a sense you've developed on this, you know, whether it's worth it. I may be completely crazy here. It just seems like that inlet becomes a bottleneck.
Yeah.
Sort of like in the AECom study where they talk about those pipes that will keep the water back in the so-called lagoon. Roosevelt Inlet does that for any water that comes through during a high tide. The water kind of gets stacked up in here. You have multiple high tides. We had that storm in the beginning of May where there was like a week of northeast winds pounding the beach. The water doesn't release, it just ratchets up over multiple tides, yeah. That's the challenge, I think, for most of.
Well, you know, it always, they can hear the historic high tide events, they have it listed. March storm 62 is second. Now that's crazy. That's from the tide gauge out there. Very general, because you can tell by the sign and the pictures and so forth.
Mhm.
The sign on Savannah Road that shows you the elevation, it's chest high. That's what it is. And in the January 23rd, 16 was nowhere near that. It was in my lower level, my front yard is elevation 4.2 on the cul-de-sacs. Real low. It was knee high. That's
Not chest high.
not chest high.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And the boardwalk at Canal Front Park is elevation 5. The floor of the restroom is elevation 6. It never made it to the restroom. It was in a walkway before you get to the restroom, but never made it. And it didn't go in kids in either. But that's just crazy.
But the point here is we don't really know the relationship between the ferry dock and all the data that have been collected there and what actually happens around
Right.
the
Not
area of the
enough.
city. You know, what the relationship is between storms and fetches and.
Do you guys have any other measured
That
Plus
goes-
a couple of feet.
information or elevations or anything, maybe at the treatment plants or,
As far as like,
you know, there's another high water mark of some sort that you've seen. We could at least compare against what's.
That's a good
I
question.
think Henry said, when Henry was here, Henry Bain, the old building official, there used to be a marker out on Cedar somewhere by where Dick Cecil used to live or live.
Oh, really? By the Children's Beach House.
He took it. It got taken down because somebody didn't want it.
Yeah. When I
It didn't
first
get a
moved
good
here-
picture. Because
when I-
it wasn't a picture that people wanted to see.
Yeah, when I first moved here, that was still that.
That's what he said. He said, not only the one on Savannah Road, but there was one down on Cedar.
You know, I never saw it, but I was told that there was one out there. But there was one.
Yes, he said it was, Henry said there was one out there, but it got removed.
Well, what about at the treatment plant? I mean, you got any stains on the wall or anything like that?
I know that in
That pump station maybe?
2013, it had gotten to the oxidation ditch.
Not into the.
Not into it, to it.
Right at the top.
Yeah.
Of the wall.
And so you think top of the top elevation of the oxidation ditch is 9.56, I think.
That's interesting.
That's not the 88.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's a comparative type of thing. Some of these numbers are.
Again, you know, just for my personal, I was living there. I've never had one above my knee. That January storm was the highest. It was higher than Sandy by a few inches. That couldn't be flooding on the beach side.
Because, you know, the complicated things with, like the storm, we're gonna find consecutive high tides backed up. I mean, not only are you driving water in from the ocean, but you've got the Delaware River draining everything north down,
That's right.
hitting it. Let alone what's coming in from the Ebenezer branch and, you know, so on and so forth. So, and I think it was Charlie's study, someone had presented data because the length of Roosevelt Inlet is actually an orifice. The breakwater is so long that the angle of the wind, whether it's coming northeast, east, or southeast, greatly affects the backup into the canal or into the bay, into the canal. And it's amazing how different it was because of that, or the depth of that orifice. And, you know, this is where, you know, the modeling of these type of things becomes next to impossible.
Right.
You kind of gotta, you know, go, okay,
Yeah.
worst case, you know, let's choose a number, recognizing that,
I'll take this.
the next-
and not this.
recognizing the next storm will be worse than whatever you just predicted. Or it could
And I
be
think
like
that's an
Sandy
important
where
concept
everything
when
got
you-
blown out.
When you look at your utility upgrades, that's the, you know, okay, it costs $10 to build it this big. And it costs only $2 more to make it bigger a little bit and solve a problem that can reach this height.
Yeah.
And, you know, that concept, I think, when we're looking through all of this, ought to stay in our heads, you know, whether it's electric, water, or sewer.
or the corollary to that, which is the other one, is that it costs X dollars to build this way. To double it in size costs you 100 times more, and you're mitigating this level
Only
of
this
risk.
much.
Yes,
Yeah.
both.
Good point.
Yeah, I
Good
mean,
point. I mean, if you've got to build a tank for 100,000 gallons, it's going to cost this much. And most of it is upfront costs and everything else. The cost for a little bit extra concrete, for
I was thinking-
120,000 gallons.
I was thinking more about like outfalls and things like that.
Yes.
Those things. And there's like, both are true
Yes, you're
in
right.
different occasions.
That's right.
Did anybody come in to the show? No.
Waste fetches.
That's the distance over which the wind can blow over the water and generate waves. So, if you have like the walls that are out in the bay, they knock the fetch down because it knocks the waves down. But if you have a long, out in the ocean, the waves get really large because the fetch could be halfway across the ocean, depending on where the storm is. Right? So it just allows, the longer the fetch, the greater the development of waves.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else for anyone? Motion to adjourn,
I'll move that.
I'll second.
all in favor? Thank you very much, this is gonna be fun.